It's like the New York Times of podcasting. Like, you need to subscribe. It is where everything happens.
And the benefit of the newsletter is that you skip all of those algorithms. As long as you've managed to convince somebody to subscribe, then it will be there for them every single day. And that is a tremendously valuable thing. I should know. I send a newsletter that reaches 33,000 people every day.
Welcome to PodBiz, the money behind the mic, where we get into the business of podcasting. I'm Norma Jean Belenke, a podcast and media strategist.
And I'm John Kiernan. I'm a podcast producer, and we're asking the question that's on everyone's mind. Where is the money in podcasting?
Each week, we talk with podcast industry professionals, marketers, and creators who are turning podcasts into a thriving business and making the industry what it is today.
With real revenue, real strategies, and real results.
If you're looking to grow or scale your show, and of course monetize, you're in the right place.
So let's get down to PodBiz.
Today, we're speaking with James Cridland, editor of Podnews and radio futurologist. We'll be speaking about the different areas podcasters can monetize, the future of podcasting, why anonymity may still be a good thing within the medium, and how Podnews got started, and James's own newsletter strategy. Let's get down to PodBiz. Thanks for joining us, James.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking.
Let's get straight into it. Where's the money in podcasting?
Where is the money in podcasting? There's a great question. I think that the money in podcasting isn't just in those annoying 30-second ads that you hear at the beginning of podcasts or in the middle of podcasts or at the end of podcasts, where obviously everybody still listens. I think that's clearly where part of the future of revenue generation is. But I think podcasting also benefits from all kinds of other ways of earning revenue from audiences, whether that's literally asking people for money, the so-called value to value model, or whether it's things like a subscription service, or indeed just selling your stuff. If you're a consultant, then a podcast is a great piece of free PR for you, or even things like doing stage shows and things like that, doing a national or an international tour. So lots of different ways. And I think when people start talking about what the future of earning revenue is from podcasts, I think everybody just instantly assumes that advertising is going to be the way. But I suspect that it's a mix of all of those and some others that we haven't even thought about, merch and that sort of thing.
And we've had a few guests on the show talk about this. I think that value for value, that term, like you mentioned, whether it's, direct, buy me a coffee, or here's the link for my PayPal in the show notes, anything like that. I think it's definitely a theme that's come up in PodBiz about being in the spirit of service, right? Whether you are a podcaster and your audience, right, is who you are serving, or whether your hosting company and podcasters are, and your users are those who you're serving. So it's definitely making sure that you provide value and create that community around the people who you serve. It's super, super important. And we've had a couple of people come on and talk super in depth about ads, which I love. I love to nerd out on the ad side. I love it when, people from the ad side come on board and spill the tea and talk about minimum amounts of downloads needed to join a network and all that kind of stuff. But like you said, there's so many opportunities for creators of all sorts. Have your own business, and you're a consultant, you can promote that through your own podcast. Maybe there's a subscription model. I've been really surprised by how much subscriptions have just come up. Apple Podcasts just presented at London Podcast Show. And so I think that model is emerging more and more so as a lot of the directories are incorporating subscriptions into their monetization models. It's super cool to see. And, creators get paid directly.
Yeah, and I think that there is definitely something in terms of direct revenue, whether it's through a subscription, whether it's through value for value or that sort of thing. Direct revenue actually allows you to be freer with what your podcast is about. It's interesting. I have access to one of these tools that ad buyers use to know whether or not your podcast is a safe podcast to advertise in. And it turns out that the daily podcast that I do is not a safe place to advertise, because I was reading out something about a true crime podcast about a year and a half ago. And that's a black mark against my show, for example. I mean, utterly pointless. But you can see that actually without the need to please advertisers all the time, or without the need to rely on advertisers. Perhaps you've got other revenue streams in there, then you can be a little bit freer in what you talk about. And I think that that's an important thing too.
I think it's also something where, number one, I think everybody wants to know the name of that program and that brand safety for advertisers. Of course, you understand, right? Like, I think if you're an advertiser, you can't place ads within media that isn't aligned or maybe is explicit, and you're, selling stuff to kids. You have to be aligned. And so I think that that's a really important aspect. And also, it really speaks to the freedom and that cowboy culture of bootstrapping it that podcasters have, right? Of you can make your own money off your own show. You don't have to tailor it for advertisers. You don't have to tailor it for anybody but your audience and what you want to say. I think that spirit of freedom is really interesting, especially with the RSS feed thing happening as well. And it's very interesting because we have, ads and the way that legacy media has come in. And, I love a lot of big shows that get hundreds of millions of downloads. And also I love shows that are like off the rails. So it really speaks to the industry as a whole, because as an independent creator, I think a lot of people come in and, they want to immediately start a podcast and they're like, okay, where's my $100 million contract? I want to be the next Joe Rogan or call her daddy. But it's also that you have so much freedom to kind of create what you want out of it. And you're going to get out of your podcast what you put into it as well.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. And there are so many different ways of why people get into podcasting in the first place. And some of the ways are just simply, I just want an excuse to call people to have conversations with. I mean, that is absolutely valid. And there are many podcasts out there which only exist because people are turning around and saying, well, I would really like to talk to Richard Branson. How do I talk to Richard Branson? Well, I start doing a podcast and then I ask him whether or not he'll appear on my show. And you never know, he might do. So I think there are lots of different ways. I think, advertising seems like the easiest one because you just put you kick your feet back and you wait for the advertisers to come.
Yeah.
And that sometimes happens and sometimes works. But actually more to the point is pleasing the audience, making sure that your audience gets great value from what you do. And that will obviously, reap the benefits and the rewards as you go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. When we're talking about that guesting strategy, I talk to people all the time about this, whether they're friends in the industry or clients or things like that. Your guesting strategy can be, you want to have a guest that your audience is going to like. You want to have a guest that maybe will bring more listeners to your podcast long-term, sustainably. You want to have a guest that maybe you want to woo them as a client. And it's a great way to just meet them and have a conversation, like you were saying. And so that guesting strategy is so interesting because podcasting, we're still really in early days. People say all the time, like, oh, it's too late, or there's a million podcasts out there. Yeah, I think the number of podcasts that exist is like 4 million, right? But actively, it's a lot less.
It is. Yeah. So it's about 350,000 the last time I looked at it. And so there are great opportunities there. And I think, also great opportunities for getting yourself known as something. So if you do a great show on, I always use the example underwater knitting when I'm doing a podcast and talking about this. Really, I have no idea why I'm doing that. But anyway, if you want to be the world's thought leader on underwater knitting, then you can absolutely do that with a podcast. And that's, and that's a useful thing. Quite why you would want to be, I really don't know, but you see what I mean.
Absolutely. And I think we're also seeing that thought leadership and that branding kind of branch out into so many other aspects of people's marketing, right? Max Cutler talked about this a lot at the London podcast show, right? And how they don't call their properties podcasts anymore. They call them shows because, they're working across multiple verticals, right? Maybe this is more on the big media side, but even for one-man band, independent creators, you're going to take maybe clips from your podcast and repurpose them for social. You're going to take your transcript and maybe make a blog post out of it or a LinkedIn article out of it. In terms of positioning yourself and your brand or your business or anything that you're working on or selling or passionate about, it really helps establish that thought leadership within whatever industry you're in, underwater knitting included.
Yeah, indeed. No, absolutely. And I think, the real opportunities there in terms of, in terms of that. One of the other things that, that isn't talked about an awful lot, but possibly should be, is newsletters.
Yeah.
I should know. I send a newsletter that reaches 33,000 people every day.
We love your
That
newsletter. Sorry, just really quickly, if you do not subscribe to Podnews, we're plugging it right here. You need to. Where have you been? You need, like, Podnews is the imminent. It's like the New York Times of podcasting. Like, you need to subscribe. It is where everything happens. Like, I'm sorry, but they yes.
It's the New York Times, as long as you like the New York Times, of course. If you don't like the New York Times, it's not the New York Times. But yes.
No, but the New York Times for many, many decades, century, was like established as the preeminent news source.
Yeah. I like to think of it, and this is possibly going over the top, but I like to think of it as the publication of record.
Absolutely.
It's where you would go back and you would go, okay, when did Max Cutler sell podcast to Spotify? You can go back and you can find that exactly in the Podnews newsletter, because every single, back issue is there. But the point I was going to make around a newsletter is that it bypasses all of the algorithms.
Yeah.
If you're there and you're doing stuff on social media, then, and the silly dance that we all do, I refuse to do it, but the silly dance that we do on LinkedIn, for example, link in comments, because apparently LinkedIn doesn't want people linking out. And so therefore you put the link in the comments, and that apparently gets past the algorithm. We're doing all of that because we want to get past the algorithm, because the algorithm will hold us back. And the benefit of obviously a newsletter is that you do, by and large, skip all of those algorithms. As long as you've persuaded somebody to subscribe, podnews.net, it's free. As long as you've managed to convince somebody to subscribe, then it will be there for them every single day, as long as you haven't been marked as spam and all that kind of stuff. And that is a tremendously valuable thing in a world where there's search engine optimization, there's even podcast search engine optimization now.
Yeah.
As well as all of the algorithms that we have on social media and everything else. So, I'm surprised that newsletters isn't more of a part of podcasting, and surprised particularly the podcast hosts haven't jumped in and said, you know what, we're also going to do a newsletter as well, a newsletter product, so that we can actually have you coming to the website. You subscribe to the newsletter, yes, but you subscribe to the podcast as well, and the other way around. So you can actually then get people's names and emails. You know exactly how many people are out there, which is something that you don't necessarily know from a podcast. So you get all of that information, and you can communicate with them in a way that hopefully they find valuable. So, I'm surprised that we don't see a little bit more of that.
I also think that we are all slaves to the algo, right? Like, that's real. I don't know how many creators, podcasters, influencers, even outside of podcasting, that are like, my business went down 50% because the algo changed, right? We're all slaves to the algorithm. And so I think you're absolutely right. Cultivating that community in the places where it can't be affected by outside influences in that way is super important. And on the directory side, that's a great point. I love the idea of popping your email in when you subscribe to a podcast as well. Just like, do you want to be part of this community? Because I think sometimes also, I do have to say, there are podcasts that I want to support or be a part of the community or, be in on, but I can't necessarily listen to every single episode, like every week. I just don't have the bandwidth. And so I think that's a really great point as well. Thanks for joining us here on PodBiz. If you're liking the show, please subscribe and write us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other podcast pros find the show. Thanks so much. And back to PodBiz. There is something to be said about anonymity from the listener's side. And I'd love to hear you speak about that as well, especially as things are evolving and as the conversation around RSS is evolving.
I think anonymity is it's one of the things that makes podcasting really interesting. You can subscribe to a podcast or follow a podcast without giving any personal information at all. And that's really useful and, and vital. I was reading an article the other day about smart TVs. And if you have an LG, so this article said, I don't know whether it's true or not, but if you have an LG television or you have a Samsung television, then what that device is doing is it's taking screenshots of what you're watching on TV and sending it back to an advertising company that is then working out what type of person you are, which fills me with abject horror. Yeah, absolute horror.
It's very Big Brother 1984. I mean,
I'm
data
not sure
is
I like it.
Yeah, data privacy is really important. And I think podcasting is one of the last forms of media that really still has that in a lot of ways.
Yeah, yeah. So I think, being able to look at that, it's something that I'm very keen about in terms of the Podnews newsletter, for example. I could measure all kinds of things in terms of clicks and in terms of, what you, Norma, look at and all of this kind of stuff. But I deliberately turn all of that stuff off. I don't run the same analytics that you would expect on most websites. Google doesn't know how many people go to my website, nor does Facebook. I don't put any of this code into those sites because, privacy is a massively important thing. And I think that that's the beauty of what podcasting offers. And there are certain podcasts, of course, that we don't want to tell our friends
Yeah,
that we're listening to. And that might be a
absolutely.
podcast, if you are, if you've got a mental illness and you're
Absolutely.
listening for support for that, you don't necessarily want to come out to everybody. Oh, so and so is listening to a podcast about such and such. So all of that kind of stuff is massively important. And so I think one of the real benefits of podcasting is also one of its downsides from an advertising point of view is that you do not know who is listening. There are lots of companies that will make inferences based on the type of thing that your IP address does and your device does and everything else. But at the end of the day, no one really knows who you are. And that's a massive benefit for being able to offer advice, being able to offer information, as much as you can.
For sensitive subjects, I mean, I've met creators who host podcasts for very specific communities of people from specific cultures about domestic violence. They've said, actually, our subscribers are very low, but our downloads are very high because it's a touchy subject and they provide resources and they're, engaged in providing community support. So I think when we're talking about how media can be safe for everybody, I think that that's a really great point. And podcasting is still one of the last places where people don't know everything about you because you clicked on something.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's super, super useful. Yeah. So it's, really important to bear that in mind as well, and obviously it's lovely for certain shows to know exactly who you're broadcasting to and
Yeah.
to get as much feedback as you possibly can. But on some other shows, that's actually a bit of a risk. And so, you might want to end up, not just not just conversations around health, but conversations around sexuality, obviously,
Yeah,
where in some parts of the world that can lead to a prison sentence. I mean,
absolutely.
all kinds of things that we need to be really, really careful of. So I think podcasting is great for that sort of thing, as well.
Well, James, you have a bit of a background, right? You started out in the UK, you worked with BBC. So, for those who might not be aware, how did you get started within podcasting specifically? I mean, obviously with Podnews, which is like the preeminent podcasting news organization, but also you're a radio futurologist. So, there's that kind of future leaning viewpoint in terms of predicting trends and all of that as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I've been involved in audio, predominantly radio, since I left school. And I always felt that there was, so much that you can do with audio. It's such a simple but powerful medium. And so very much focusing on what you could do there. So I started working for a bunch of radio stations in the UK. I was working at Virgin Radio in 2003 in the UK. And um, I was in charge of the team that ran the website, and I looked at this thing in sort of September, October of 2003. People were beginning to talk online about these things that they just named podcasts, and what should we be doing with these and everything else. And I thought this is probably an opportunity for the radio station I work for. So we actually had up and running in January of 2004, which was really early, way before
Wow. Yeah.
Apple put podcasts in. We had up and running a daily podcast, which was our breakfast show. And what we would do is we had a little algorithm that would take bits of that breakfast show and make it into a podcast that was a daily podcast that was doing incredible download numbers at the time. I mean, really, really high, well over 10,000 downloads per episode. I mean,
Wow.
it's astonishingly good. We launched that in March of 2000 and March of 2005. It was March of 2005, and that was fun to sort of play around with and fun to see, well, what can we do with this technology? How can we actually, run, all of this? And so I've been, very interested in on-demand audio and podcasting, ever since. Worked at the BBC for a couple of years on what they did for on-demand radio and live radio on the internet,
Yeah.
and podcasting and stuff like that. I was at a radio conference back in 2017 in the US, billed itself as the international, I think it was the Worldwide Radio Summit it billed itself as, and I may have been the worldwide bit. And I remember talking to a friend of mine in the bar afterwards, and I was saying, he was saying, where do you get your news about podcasting? And I said, well, there isn't anywhere really, is there? Nick Quire was writing about podcasting, but only writing about a small sector of the much larger industry. And I thought, well, maybe there's something that I could do there. And within a month or so, I'd started that up. So, it was quite lucky in that there really wasn't anything else on a daily basis that I could do. And I thought to myself, well, let's do that and let's see what happens there. Yeah. And here I am nearly 10 years later.
Yeah.
I've written it every single day since, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was on a lovely family holiday last week, and which was absolutely fantastic. And of course, still had an hour a day to
Yep.
quickly cobble
Yeah.
together a newsletter, which is always fun. No, it's but it is great, and it's I think what's nice about the podcasting industry is that we're still very young as an industry. Podcasting is only 21
Yeah.
years old.
Yeah.
So that means that we're still feeling our way in many ways. And we're feeling our way in terms of how we make money out of this. We're feeling our way in terms of what's best for the industry, but we're also feeling our way in terms of making mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes are bad for audiences or bad for the industry. And it's nice to be able to sometimes give a little bit of oxygen to those mistakes to make sure that we don't make those mistakes in future. And so I think it's been nice to be able to affect some change in the industry and keep the industry as audience focused as it really has been up until this point anyway. And so that's been, really good fun to do.
So what would you say is one key move or metric or even a mindset that's made the biggest impact on your podcasting career and building Podnews?
The one thing that I do know is consistency. Over
Yes.
anything else, consistency is the real win. I used to talk about, you mentioned that I'm a radio futurologist. It's amazing what you can do if you print your own business cards. You can call yourself anything. But one of the things why radio is so successful and why radio continues to be so successful, and by the way, everybody's talking about the death of radio. It's still 5 times bigger than podcasting. So
Yeah.
there's nothing going wrong with that. One of the reasons why radio has been so successful is consistency. You wake up to the same voice every day. You listen to the same station. You understand what that station does. The station has a format that you can follow throughout the day. All of that kind of stuff. And that really translates into podcasting as well. I have a particular podcast that I listen to when I'm doing the groceries on a Saturday morning. I have a particular podcast that I listen to when I'm walking the dog on a Wednesday afternoon. I have a particular podcast that I listen to in the gym, et cetera, and I think that habitual thing, that consistency of,
Yes.
I know what I'm going to get for this podcast, and I know when it comes out every single week or every single day, and so therefore I can rely on that. I think that's a massively important thing. And so, and the same goes for writing a newsletter. It's making sure that it's consistently the same thing, that it doesn't change, and that it comes out at roughly the same sort of time every single day. I think that's a really important thing, and something that very few people actually, teach you about when you're getting into this. And so I think, that's just a super simple thing, but it's probably the thing that I've learned, most over the last few years. Yeah.
I think that's really the hallmark, right, of a podcast that stands the test of time. It keeps going. And that really rings true across everything that creators do, right? In your social media, in your overall branding, in the tone of your show, in your publishing schedule. All of that is so important. As you keep going, you're going to refine more and more. But showing up every day is the real work.
Consistency doesn't mean everything needs to stay exactly the same every single
Yeah.
day, every single week, every single year.
Yeah.
You can obviously change and evolve and everything else, but do that in a slow and sensible way is, I guess, what I would say in terms of that. So I think that that's certainly been one of the key takeaways that I've seen. I think the other thing that I'm always surprised by is the amount of people who go, I want more listeners, therefore I should go out and buy a better microphone. And I'm just like there, and I find it very difficult. Yes, obviously, technology and stuff is fun and it's nice to have, but a better microphone isn't going to get you more listeners. More
Yeah. How about
listeners is
some
going to come
marketing?
from
Right.
marketing or content. I mean, as long as your audio is good enough, then your audio is going to be absolutely fine. And part of, I think, the problem that podcasting has that, for example, radio didn't, is because radio is really heavily gatekeeped. It's got a
Yes.
lot of gatekeepers. I just made a new verb there. Because there are lots of people in the way of you and getting on the air, it
Yeah.
means that you have an awful lot of training. You have an awful lot of help in terms of what you
Yeah.
do before you actually start. You know how a microphone works. You know how best to sit in front of a microphone and make sure that you sound as good as you possibly can. All of that stuff is missing from podcasting because you get a microphone in a box and you plug it in. And the most popular microphone in the world for many years for podcasting has been the Blue Yeti, which is a very cheap USB microphone. And many people get it out of the box, put it in front of them and talk into the top of the microphone. And as if the microphone works that way. But a Blue Yeti, it works from the side, not from the top. Just simple, straightforward things. But unless there's anybody teaching you that, you will make that mistake. We just need to be aware that the amount of training that we had in the olden days of radio in the 70s and so on is very different to where podcasting is now. And actually, there's an awful lot to learn on how to get the best out of the equipment that you already have, rather than just rushing out and buying a fancy new microphone because it's the one that Joe Rogan uses. That's certainly a thing too.
I think we've both seen podcasts that are very successful on shoestring budgets and podcasts that have enormous budgets that faceplant and then fade away, right?
I think the thing I'm seeing more and more now is people copying what they see on YouTube. And actually, to a great degree, the microphones that you see in podcasts on YouTube, to a great degree, they're actually just props. They're not even plugged in. Because actually the microphone for the person is hiding under their shirt there that you can't actually see.
Right. It's a lapel. Right.
And that's where the audio is coming from. But they've still got these massive, great big microphones in front of them because that is the thing that communicates that you are a podcast.
Yep.
And so
here's
I think
my big mic. I'm a podcaster.
Here's my big mic, but I will put it 5 miles away from my face, but it still communicates that I'm a podcaster, but it's absolutely not the right way of using a microphone. But I think quite a lot of people look at that and go, oh, so that's where I should put my microphone. No. So it's just one of those hard things, I guess.
Yeah. Well, James, what's something that people don't know about what you do?
Gosh, there's a question. I think quite a lot of people are surprised when I say that I not only write the Podnews newsletter every day, but I've also coded all of the website and all of the tools that go around that. And I think that that's been very useful for me because it's allowed me to get rid of some of the non-creative sort of chore things that I would otherwise, laying a newsletter out with, and let's go and get the artwork for this podcast and put it in this table here. I've got code that does all of that for me. So I don't have to worry about that. All of the non-creative stuff doesn't get in the way. I can just do the creative stuff and move on. And I think that's been a really useful thing. And I think we're seeing more and more creatives now, not necessarily programming as I do, but certainly using tools like ChatGPT and other similar tools to get rid of some of the less creative stuff so that they can focus on the more creative sort of side of that. So I think that that's certainly, something that I've been very lucky in, that I know how to code. I know how to, how to do certain jobs so that I can be freed up to do more creative things. And I would certainly recommend to everybody, as much as you can, play around with some of these tools and see whether or not it will actually save you doing the dull and boring stuff so you can do more exciting stuff, in the meantime.
Yes. And you spoke about this in London on our panel on AI, about how, AI can really be used to enhance your creativity because it'll take a lot of things off your plate. Like you were saying, you're not doing that. You're mostly coding yourself, but a lot of AI tools like ChatGPT, Gemini, they can be used to support a lot of the work that hinders creativity, and that's labor intensive. So then when you get around to doing creative stuff, you're kind of burnt out. But AI it's an interesting time. Well, James, if you had to start over today, what would you do differently to grow faster or smarter?
I tell you what I wouldn't necessarily do, and that's I wouldn't rush into video, because I'm not sure that will make me grow faster or anything else. I mean, make as many good relationships as you possibly can with the types of people in the industry that you're looking to reach. So again, to come back to the underwater knitting example, if you are doing a little bit of that, if you're doing a show about that, then you should be in every forum on Reddit or on the internet in general about underwater knitting. You should be talking to the manufacturers of the knitting yarn that is specifically made for underwater knitting and the knitting needles and everything else. You should be part of that world, because actually that's where you are reaching your audience. And particularly, you should go to the underwater knitting conferences and you should get people to listen to your show. If you're not doing that, then you're not going to reach as many people as you could do. And it's part of marketing, but it's the hard yarn of marketing, going to places and actually meeting people, with business cards, with ideally a nice QR code to where your podcast lives on it, and all of that kind of stuff. I think that would be something that, I started doing that relatively quickly when I was doing the Podnews newsletter, but I think, I should have been doing more of that. And then there was a thing called the pandemic that got in the way.
Just that little old global pandemic.
Yeah.
No, I think you're right. Podcasting is really a relational medium. Podcasting is still so young that we're all very collaborative. I've met very few people that are competitive within the space to the point where they won't have a conversation with you or try and have some sort of reciprocal relationship where you can help each other and support each other's projects and initiatives. We're still at that point where everybody's like gung-ho. And when you go to a podcasting conference, especially in person, first of all, we all love to talk forever. So you're at a conference with people who like to talk. So that's number one. But number two is everybody you meet is like excited to meet you. They want to hear about your podcast. They want to hear about what you're doing. They want to hear about your podcast service business, how you got into the industry, what you're passionate about, what projects you have upcoming, what you like to listen to. It's definitely a really fun experience to nerd out with other media nerds in that way. And, I think
And I think there's two sides of that. There's going to a big podcast conference like Podcast Movement, for example, which is a great place to learn new things. The way that I always think of a conference is if you leave a conference after a couple of days, having learnt 2 new things and maybe made 2 new friends, and that's it. It's paid for itself. Great. Anything extra you get on top of that, well, brilliant. But actually, all you need are a couple of new ideas for you to go, I should be doing this, I should be doing that. So that's super useful. But also, if you're doing a podcast which is about anything else in life, accountancy, go to the accountancy conferences.
Yes, absolutely.
Go to the accountancy meetups. I'm sure that accountants are very exciting people. I'm sure that they have, monthly meetups. The accountants chapter are going and having, beers and bowls and everything else. And I'm sure they're having a fantastic time. Go there, because that's just as important. By the way, don't go to Podcast Movement or some of those other big podcast conferences with the goal of getting more people to listen to your show. because
No, you have to be niche specific, but it's really
nobody's interested in that.
No, but I also think that
apart
it's
from
like,
yours or mine, of course, which is a little bit
right.
different.
But I also think that that's where you're going to, maybe you're going to meet somebody else who has an accounting podcast and you're like, okay, we can do a swap. Or, okay, I've learned more tips about how to use the mic I already have, right?
Yeah,
Or
absolutely.
I've learned more about discoverability within, my top 2 directories, that kind of thing. So, but I definitely agree. You have to go hard on your niche. That's something a few other people have said. I want to make sure it's go hard on your niche, because really you're providing an opportunity for people within whatever industry or interest that you are podcasting about to really connect with you and like nerd out. It's such a special interest kind of medium where you can go as niche as you want, underwater knitting included. Well, James, we always ask everybody one last question here. Of course, I'm extra excited because you are a radio futurologist as well as editor of Podnews. But what are you most excited about coming up within the podcasting industry?
I think I'm excited about a few things. I'm excited about the accessibility that we are beginning to see for podcasts. It means, things like transcripts, which are now available in more and more
standard
podcast apps. Yeah, as standard in most now, which is really helpful. That's really useful for a number of different reasons. Firstly, for searching and things like that, but also to make those more accessible to other people. And Apple Podcasts with the new iOS 26, Apple Podcasts has a little tool in there called Enhanced Dialogue. And what that does is that gets rid of all of the background noise. Maybe it gets rid of music. If you're an annoying person like me that puts music underneath their short daily podcast, it'll get rid of that completely. So all you can hear is the voice. So if you have hearing difficulties, or maybe this podcast is in a different language than is your main language, it just clarifies that and makes that easier to listen to. So there's a lot of that stuff which is coming, which I think is really exciting. I think, to me, going a little bit sort of nerdy, there are a number of new features that are coming into podcasting in a thing called Podcasting 2.0, which is a very nerdy way of saying that there are new features that are slowly getting there. And one of the features that I'm most interested about is something called the location tag. And what the location tag allows you to do as a podcaster is it allows you to say where you are, where you're recording this particular show, because some people might be interested in that. The town or the suburb, obviously, but then also what your show is about. So maybe you are doing a show about the Eiffel Tower, but you happen to be recording it in Dublin, in Ireland. It's just different ways of people finding that particular show and go, you know what, I would love to find all of the podcasts out there which are about tourist places in Paris because I'm going in 2 months' time. And so your podcast app, or maybe something completely different, maybe the travel app, a travel app that you're using, can go, okay, if you're going to Paris, then here are 7 or 8 episodes about specific places in Paris that you can learn more about as a podcast. That to me is a great new way of getting into podcasts that we've never had before. And so I'm really excited about seeing what the future of that particular thing, of adding locations to podcasts, can actually mean for people finding new shows which can really help them understand the world, the world around them. And I think, that will be really interesting to have a look at.
Well, James Cridland, editor of Podnews and radio futurologist, thanks for joining us here on PodBiz.